Good morning, everyone. I'm glad to be here. I'm excited that we're going to be continuing on in our series this week, where, as you can see, in part 6 of our series on our core values, and we're going to be talking about our core value that we are a church for the unchurched. And this one is particularly close to my heart for a couple reasons. One of them is because for the last 3 years I've been living in New Jersey, and the majority of my friends over there were people from unchurched backgrounds. When I tell people about it, a lot of times they think I'm just telling them a bad joke, because I used to work with a Muslim, a Mormon, a Jehovah's Witness, and then there was me, and there were a bunch of other people. But the four of us sometimes would be working together, and the Mormon would say, Jesus is like God. And then the Jehovah's Witness would say, no, Jesus is an angel. And then the Muslim would say, why are we talking about Jesus? And then I would say, nothing. I would sit and I would rake leaves and kind of laugh. But those relationships became really meaningful relationships to me. And I grew to care a lot for these guys, and they grew to care about me. And I think that those are the sorts of relationships that God has called us to in our lives today. And I think that that's something that God has for everyone in this church. Another reason why this is close to my heart is that I work with the teens in our church. And as many of us know, 3 out of 4 teenagers that grow up in the church will leave the church by the time they're 20. It's a very difficult time for people to process life. We go through a lot of change. We start to define ourselves. We start to deal with more and more critiques at school. We start to have teachers that come against us. And so when I deal with our teens, they are right on the forefront, the front lines of the faith. And I see how difficult it is to be someone who believes in God and believes that God is active. And then I talk to parents, and I hear parents talk to me about how, listen, my kid is dealing and struggling with maybe belief in miracles or something, and I want to be able to help them, but I have my own doubts myself. I'm not exactly sure that I'm willing to go there. And so a lot of times they want me to go and save their kids, which I really want to go and talk to your kids. But this is a family affair. Tim said it before, the church is a family. And part of that means us learning how to deal with honest doubt, with honest critique, with grace, and with humility. And so this is a message for everyone. This is a message for those of us who've gone to church since we were young, and those of us who this might be your first time. We say that this is a church for the unchurched, and that means that in every one of these services, we have people who have never been to church before. We also have people who've been to church for 60 years. So if you've never been to church before, I want to clarify, this sign is not true. It's an illustration that I'll talk about. And there are more signs that if you can't see them, they say no friends allowed and members only. Those are not the case. Everyone is welcome here. And now, if you have gone to church your whole life, I have a message for you. Be nice. It's very likely that someone sitting next to you or someone in your immediate vicinity has never been to church before. Or that they think of themselves as coming from a background that is non-Christian, or they think of themselves as unchurched, or they're struggling with doubt. So be nice to them. Because God calls us to a drastic sort of empathy. God calls us to step out of what's comfortable in our lives and step into other people's worlds. And so that's what I wanted to talk about. And when I was trying to think of places in the Bible that we could use to discuss this concept, there are a lot of options. One of them that I was thinking of doing was the woman at the well. And in that story, Jesus talks to someone from a different religious sect. It's like equivalent to if I went up, well, that would make me Jesus. If Pastor Tim went up, who's our senior pastor and my father-in-law, if Pastor Tim was meeting with a Muslim, that's sort of the equivalent of what was happening. And Jesus met with this woman, and they talked. at this well, and eventually she becomes an evangelist, and she loves what Jesus has to say. And I don't know about all of you, but when I go to a restaurant and I say, yeah, I'll have water, the waitress doesn't usually become an evangelist. It's not that relatable of a story. Though it's a beautiful story, sometimes it's hard for us to really jive with it. So I picked another passage, and it comes from a section where the Apostle Paul, the church planter Paul, was answering questions from the church in Corinth. And they had a lot of questions about things that were distracting them in church. And there were three in particular. The first was what people were eating. The second was how people were dressing. And the third was how rich and poor people got along together. And I think that the eating passage, the first one, has a lot for us to talk about. The second one, how people were dressing, has actually been used in a lot of really negative ways over the years to say some pretty hard things about women and their roles and things like that. And I wanted to talk about that as well, but I couldn't. And so I did a bunch of research, and if you want to find that research, it will be on our Facebook page. There will be a link to it. So you can find Washington Cathedral on Facebook and go and check it out next week. But this week, we're talking about a passage that has to do with eating meat, something very close to my heart. For some of us, very literally close to our heart. But this passage requires a lot of context. And the reason why is because it talks about some things that we don't really have to deal with today. But one thing is the same both in the Bible and today, and that's that buying food in the market is very dangerous. And what I mean by that is when I am told, Ben, you need to go get groceries, or requested to go get groceries, and I have to go get chicken, I look at the labels on chicken, and it's like 30 miles long. There are so many different things that you have to figure out, like grain versus grass-fed, no preservatives, and free range, and it had a lot of friends, and his name was Jeff. There's a lot involved in buying groceries. And that was the same in Paul's day when he was writing to the Corinthians, but their issues were very, very different. So, for example, there was this practice where when someone would be worshiping a god, they would take an animal, take it to the temple, and the priests would then slaughter the animal and then sell the meat at discount. The worship part was giving the animal. That was your way to say, like, I submit to this god, here, have something that I own, and the way to not own it anymore is to kill it. And the way to pay for the temple was to sell the meat. And so Paul is talking about that, and it's sort of like saying, like, listen, guys, steaks from Costco are okay. You're good. Go ahead. And I actually agree. I think that steaks from Costco are great. But there was a lot of danger involved in that process because, for example, when Jewish people would go to the market, the way that Jewish people lived out their relationship to God was through the things that they touched and the things that they ate. So if you eat something that has been offered to another god as worship, are you then worshiping that other god? Or if you are eating meat that wasn't properly prepared, what will be the cost to you? There was a lot of danger involved. Similarly, for Greeks, there was the question of these gods were the gods of the Roman Empire. And so if someone says, here, eat this meat, and you say, no, I don't know who it was given to, that was an act of subversion. To say, listen, I don't submit to the Roman Empire. I don't believe in their gods. And so it was dangerous. And in a lot of ways, it was more dangerous than when I have to pick between organic and not. And so, when they're asking, what happens when someone invites me to a meal? What am I supposed to do? This is a very, dangerous, anxiety-filled thing that they're dealing with. And so we can look at the passage now that you sort of understand what it's saying. And it's 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 24 through 29. It says, nobody should seek their own good, but the good of others. Eat anything sold in the meat market without raising question of conscience, for the earth is the Lord and everything that's in it. If some unbeliever invites you to a meal, and if you want to go, eat whatever is put before you without raising question of conscience. But if anyone says to you, 'This has been offered in sacrifice,' then do not eat it, both for the sake of the person who told you and for conscience sake. The other man's conscience, I mean, not yours." So what Paul is saying there is something that is actually a pretty large break in convention. Convention says that we're supposed to hem ourselves in. We're supposed to be safe. We're supposed to do what's comfortable. And what Paul is saying is when someone invites you who believes totally different than you, you need to be willing to step out and to step into their worldview. You need to be willing to eat the food that they give you, which some of us, when our friends cook, that is a dangerous thing. But we also need to be willing to have discernment. So that when someone says, "Listen, this food is prepared on behalf of another God," you need to be willing to hold firmly to what you believe, even in the case that it might cause you some difficulty, even in the case that it might be dangerous for you. So Paul is saying, on the one hand, we need this radical sort of empathy. But on the other hand, we need to be able to know who we are and know what we believe, and to hold on to that and see the value in that. And an example of this is, since these meals were offered sort of as prayers, it's sort of like if Paul was saying, listen, if someone from the Redmond Mosque or from a Mormon temple or from some other religion says, "Come to my house and pray with me," by all means go. That's fine. Go pray. But if they say that this prayer means that you believe in a God different than who you believe, if they say that, then abstain from the prayer. But the beautiful thing about this passage, and why it's one of my favorites, is we don't abstain from that prayer because we're fighting and we're contesting to be mean about it. We're doing it just so that they're not confused. You don't eat that meat. You don't pray that prayer because you don't want people to think that you're someone other than who you are. So Paul is saying you need to be able to step out, to be open, to accept everyone. But on the other hand, you need to be able to be firm and to know what you believe. And so that's what he's called us to do, and it's really terrifying. And I was listening to a podcast, and I'll let you guys know just how big of a nerd I am. I really love like design, like web design, graphics design, and architecture and things like that. And I was listening to an architecture podcast, and I loved it so much that I actually gave money to the organization afterwards. I only gave them $1, but I just wanted them to know, like, it was a philosophical move to say, like, I support this. Because I loved this podcast so much. And a podcast, by the way, is like radio over the internet, for those of you who don't know. And the thing is, and why I can say I'm such a nerd, is that the podcast was about revolving doors versus like flapping doors. And I just thought it was really interesting. But it illustrates our point really well, that it's hard for us to be willing to step out and to step into something difficult, in this case, literally, a revolving door. And the reason why it's hard is because revolving doors are terrifying. I don't know about you, but like when I walk up to a revolving door and if it's already moving, there's this thing where you have to like time it right and like wait to get in because it's already going. And then in the last sermon, I had to wear robes because it's the more traditional service. And so if you have to wear robes out around and you go through a revolving door, your robes might get stuck in it. Or like worst of all, someone might be walking with you and they might get stuck in the revolving door and you might like have to be very close for a minute. And then what happens if you get stuck going around and you get another stranger? It's, to me, I don't know about you, revolving doors give me anxiety. And apparently it is true for a lot of other people, because what these architects were saying is that revolving doors are something everyone should use because they're good for the environment. They let out 8 times less hot air than flappy doors. And so it's good. We should be using revolving doors. It saves energy, saves money, it's great. But people are afraid of them. Some of the studies that they did said that it was 28% of people use revolving doors to the others that use the flappy doors. And so they came up with this really amazing campaign to try to get people to use revolving doors. What they did is they made little arrows and they put them on the flappy doors pointing towards the revolving doors. That was all it was. But it was amazing the effect that little bitty sign could do. Because after they made the signs and after a couple iterations of changing things, they changed the statistics where it was 28% using the revolving door to 70% using the revolving door, even though they're terrifying. And they said in some cases, people even waited in line to use the revolving door, all because of a little bitty arrow, a little bitty sign. And to me, that was powerful because I had planned on having someone make these signs for me. And it showed me the power of the little signs that we do. And the thing is, in church, there are a lot of signs that people see and people interpret and people put up themselves that say a lot of negative things. For some of us who maybe you haven't gone to church before, or maybe you don't feel like you fit in here, your signs and your conventions that you try to follow say, listen, I've been hurt in the past. I don't want to open myself up because I don't want to have to deal with that stuff. Or, listen, the world's been hard on me, and so I don't want to have to be a kind and nice person. I want to be anonymous. I want to just slip in and slip out. Or for some of us who've been in the church our whole lives, our signs are, I have honest doubt that I have been too afraid to give any credence in my mind because I'm worried that if I think those thoughts and I like actually take the time to consider it, that doubt might overcome my faith. That I might be swayed. And so a lot of us deal with these little things and we put up these barriers in our lives that are very subtle but very powerful. And what Paul is saying is you need to be willing to break down all of those barriers. And that goes to people who have never been to church before. Jesus welcomes everyone, and we need to be willing to open up and to step in to that way of thinking. But it's also true for those of us who've been in church our whole lives. Jesus welcomes everyone, and that means we need to be willing to step out and to empathize with people in ways that are totally radical. And so Paul gives us that example. And the thing about that is when you step out, it's scary because you have to give up a lot of things. You have to give up the idea that your opinion is a fact. You have to stop believing that everything that I believe is the only way it can be and the only way someone can see things, and you need to be willing to see things from the other person's point of view. You need to give up on apathy based on ignorance to say, listen, they believe different than me, and that's it. That's fine. They're done. I don't have to deal with them. And we do that even in our families, where we have fights that last for decades. And we say, listen, they're just who they are, and that's it, and when we're done. But you never take the time to actually find out who they are or what has brought them to that place, to open up again. We have to give up on inaction. We have to give up on discrimination. We have to give up on judgmentalism. And that is very, very hard work. And the thing is that a lot of times we hold on to those things because we think of faith as having answers. Like we look at pastors and we say, pastors have all this faith because when I come to them with my questions, they can say something. The thing is, faith is not having answers. Faith is knowing what we know to be true and to being firm in that fact. Faith is knowing that when I was a kid, God provided for my family. When I was 2 years old and I had a stomach thing, it's an anti-cesarean, I think is what it's called, and I could have died. That my mom knew from somewhere other than her, because I couldn't talk, very well, that my mom knew to take me to the doctor, and that I got a surgery and I'm alive today. I know that when I was in my second semester of college, I got 2 grants that I neither qualified for nor applied for, and I got them in the second semester of school, and I got them twice. The same grant 2 times. And I say that that's a miracle because this was a grant given to women who had a GPA way higher than I had. And I got it twice. And it paid the exact amount I needed to make it through my second semester of school. Faith is being able to say that, listen, last month someone came to my office from Kirkland and said, I want to accept Christ as my personal Lord and Savior, and I want to turn my life around. It's knowing that Jesus' life, death, and resurrection are alive here in this community because we see people living like Christ. We see people who are suffering like Christ, and Christ is right there with them. They're aware of God's presence, and we see people who have been through spiritual death, who've been through hell on earth, coming alive again anew. We know that God is active and working in this community. And so it gives us the faith to be able to step out and to say, listen, I don't agree with what you say, and I have doubts myself, but I'm going to walk through this with you. I'm going to be able to hold firmly to what I believe, that God is working, but I also am going to embrace you in ways that feel dangerous to me and maybe make me bring up questions that I've never dealt with before. And it's ironic because a lot of times we don't step out because we feel like then I'll have to deal with my own doubts. But the only way to deal with your own doubts is to step out, is to actually live your faith out. An example of this is, for me, when I spent the last 3 years in Princeton, and I enrolled in an Arabic class. I don't know what I was thinking. I enrolled in an Arabic class at Princeton University, and it was the most difficult thing I've ever done. I got headaches before and after every class on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. I would basically be crying getting onto the bus, and Becca would hold my hand and walk me to the bus, and Ben, you can handle it. You can do this. You did it last week. And I was like, but it's way harder this week. And then I'd cry to class, and I'd try to man up when I go into class, and then it would be hard. And so, and I was struggling. So I went to my professor, who, by the way, my translation of her name is the Honorable Preacher of the Love of God, which might not actually be how you say her name, but that's what all those words in her name mean, and I love Arabic names, so I just had to say it. I went to her, and I said, Professor, I'm really struggling, and she said, yes, you are. And I said, I really need some help. And she goes, okay, but I want to help you, but you can't waste my time. You have to apply this in your other studies. You're a preacher, you read the Bible, so read the Bible in Arabic, and then when you get stuck, come to me. And I don't know the Bible that well, so I'll find similar parts of the Quran that we can talk about the grammar about, and then we'll present in class, you and me, about these different passages. And so me and my professor would meet at least once a week, and we would talk about the Bible and the Quran. And over time, you can't help but form a relationship when you're talking to people about your faith. And we were very honest about what we believed. We held it really firmly. Secretly, maybe we were both trying to convert each other. I don't know. But a relationship started to form. And then over the course of the year, we started to hear about some difficult things happening in my professor's family. And so we waited after class. Most of the class did, and waited to ask to see how she's doing. And then I waited until everyone left, and I said, hey, I just want you to know that I'm praying for you. And when I said that, you could tell it meant a lot to her, and she said, Ben, a lot of people don't know this, but Muslims pray as well. And I've been praying for every one of you students as well, and I really care about you. And after that, I was hooked. Like, I would carry her books to her car just so I could get more time to hang out with her. We really cared a lot about each other. And so when it came time to turn in my final project, I brought Becca along with me. so that Becca could meet this professor that I've been raving about forever. And when my professor saw Becca and saw me bringing in the paper, she kind of teared up, and she ran up and she gave Becca this big hug, and she kissed her on the cheek, and she just kept like petting her arm and coming and hugging her and talking about all these things, talking about how she loves Ben and all these things. And it was like a year's worth of affection for me all came out in like 5 minutes on Becca. And Becca was kind of overwhelmed. And it's because she's my professor, and she comes from a different cultural background, so she can't be hugging me all the time. That's just not appropriate. So it all came out on Becca. And it was amazing to me because this is me, Ben, a kid from Kirkland who I never even thought that I was going to be going to college. It was a miracle when I went to college to me. And now here I am in Princeton University, in the office of a Muslim Arabic instructor, crying because we care about each other so much. And it's not the typical sort of miracle that we think of when we talk about opening up and sharing who we are and sharing our faith honestly. Because we read stories like Jesus and the woman at the well, where she becomes an evangelist. And that is not even close to what happened. That was never even the goal. It was just that we cared about each other. The miracle, though, was that together we both experienced God, and I started to see God in myself. When she would bring up questions about, like, why do you Christians say that? And I say, I have no idea. It was amazing to me because I started to see God working in my own life. And I started to see God working in the lives of other people around me. And that, to me, is a miracle. Another example of this is I talked at the beginning about the guys on the grounds crew that I worked with. And so they cared about me a lot. I worked with them for a couple of years. And they would always say, Ben, what's wrong with you? Why don't you have any babies yet? Because they all love their families very much. And I was already 25 years old. What was wrong with me? And so they would do that. And so in our final year, me and Becca's senior year, I finally told them, like, you know what, guys, I do actually want a baby. I think that I want one. And they picked on me all the time. They would say, Ben, you're going to be a dad, and other things that I probably shouldn't say in church. But they picked on me a lot. And that went on for a couple months. And then a couple more months went on, and they stopped picking on me, and then a couple more months went on, and it was getting hard because Becca and I still hadn't conceived, and it's difficult. That's a hard place to be in. And so I finally opened up to them, and I said, guys, this has been really difficult for me, and it's kind of confusing and scary, and I don't know what to say. And they didn't say, like, well, Ben, we love you. Because they're gruff men. They don't say things that way. So they just sort of went, And then a couple weeks later, it was a cold day, and we were stuck. We had locked ourselves in a truck because it was cold out. It was a truck that seats 3 people, and there were 4 of us, and I was stuck in the middle. And the 3 guys sort of opened up to me right before I went to go home. And they said, hey, Ben, we just want you to know that we care about you and Becca, and we're praying for you. And then throughout the rest of the week, the other guys would come up to me, and they'd tell me their stories, and they would say, hey, Ben, we care about you, and we're praying for you. And it was so touching to me. And it's so easy for us in our lives to put up these barriers that say, church is for like-minded individuals. Church is for people like me. Or I've been hurt, and so I get to put up these walls, and I don't have to look at the world through anyone else's eyes because I'm right, or because I've been hurt, or because of whatever. And it's easy for us to shut ourselves off. But when a Muslim, a Mormon, and a bunch of atheists tell you they're praying for you, it changes the way you think about God. It changes the way you see the world, because these are the guys that I had been praying for years. Their names are all written in my Bible. And I had said, God, I just want them to see who you are. And they say, hey, I care about you, and I'm praying for you. That is a miracle. And it doesn't come from us holding on to our beliefs so strongly that we have to be mean about it. It doesn't mean that I was the office creeper where I would hang out by the water hole and say, hey guys, if you accepted Jesus Christ as your personal Lord and Savior, it's not that kind of thing. And there is a place for you to share your faith when someone says, I want to know what Christianity has to say. Then you got to be ready. But it comes from being able to step out of your worldview, the place that you're comfortable with, and to step in and see the world from someone else's eyes. And it's scary, but it's what God has called us to do. And it's what Washington Cathedral has been doing for years. It's why we have a dump. We have a project in the dump in Tegucigalpa, Honduras. Because we want to see the world through the poor's eyes, and we know that they have things to offer us. They have things that we need to learn. It's the reason why we have the Videra congregation and the Egyptian Orthodox, the Coptic congregation. It's why we have a singles ministry that's growing all the time, and it's bigger now and more vibrant now than it's been in a long time. Not that it was ever bad, but it's in an amazing place. And our recovery programs are doing amazing things. God is alive and active in our church. And part of that is the way that we interact with people from an unchurched background. And so if you think of yourself as unchurched, or if you think of yourself as on the way there, you're welcome here. But it means that all of us need to step it up. God is calling for us to have a revival in our lives, to change the way that we relate to people. In Seattle, there's this way, the Seattle invite to coffee, where when you say, hey, we should get coffee sometime, what you actually mean is, hey, we should definitely not get coffee sometime. You know? God is calling us to do more than that. God is calling us to be willing to step in to this world that Jesus has, where he relates to people in their deepest doubts and their deepest fears. And that is where we find God, and that is where we see miracles. And that's the thing that God is calling for us to do. God has a plan for this church, and that is a part of it. And so in the bulletin, I came up with 3 different things that we can do, and you can see them right here. The first one is to let someone know that you're praying for them. Someone who's struggling, someone maybe of a different faith, maybe of the same faith, but who you disagree with really strongly, to let them know that you're praying for them. But first you have to actually pray for them. Don't lie. So pray for people, and then let them know that you're praying for them. And you'll be amazed at what can happen. The second thing is to start incorporating Christian practices into your daily life. For those of you who have families, it can be praying before meals so that your friends and your kids' friends know that you're a Christian family. Or it could be any other kind of way to do that, but start incorporating it so that it becomes obvious who you are and what you believe. And the last one is kind of a thought exercise. And what I want you guys to do this week is to think through someone maybe in your workplace or someone who you've had a disagreement with about faith. Think through things from their point of view. So take a minute and think, what do they believe? And how do my beliefs or people or things that they've heard about the church or Christianity, how could those things be hurtful? How could those things be misinterpreted? How could they be taken in a way that they don't like? And how can I say those in a way, how can I be honest about who I am and what I believe, but also, how can I listen with empathy? How can I see the world through their point of view? And go through and think through, and people in your life, how can I do that? And then my advice would be, actually try doing it. That's a lot harder. And so the first step is to practice it in your head. And so those are the things that I think that God has called us for. The important thing for us to recognize is that Jesus did not die for an ethics system. He didn't die for philosophy, for theology. Jesus died for people. He died trying to show everyone God's love so that we could all come and experience God's love. And so our job as a church is not to hold on to a philosophy, is not to hold on to a theology or an ethics, though we do have all of those things. What's important is people. and that everyone here feels welcome, and that these signs never come up invisibly in our lives. And so that, I think, is what God has for us. And I think it's what is going to help us to continue to grow and change and become the church that God wants us to be.